Okay, so we've been talking about how groups, work groups or teams form, and we talked about the five-stage model, but also the punctuated equilibrium model. And we also talked about important organization or characteristics of the groups or teams that we want to look at, including how the norms are created, the social roles are created, and what defines the cohesiveness of a team. We're now going to talk about theories of both what can go wrong and right as far as productivity of a group or team. So we're mainly focusing now on once a team starts to actually perform, what can either increase that performance or what can hamper that performance. So the first thing we need to recognize is the concept of social loafing. And this comes directly from social psychology and is very strongly supported. And basically, at its most easy to understand concept, social loafing basically suggests that if people have the opportunity to be lazy, they will take it. That is somewhat kind of a core part of being people. So social loafing, in a way, somewhat supports the theories of kind of theory X management, that people have to be forced to work. This isn't completely true, but what it does mean is that if you set up a social situation that allows people to be lazy, if it allows people to get lost in the woodwork, that there at least some people will take advantage of that. So social loafing is the reduction in individual effort that occurs when people work in groups, specifically driven by some situational factors. So people are less likely to loaf when A, they believe their individual efforts will be identified, and B, others are going to be personally affected by their effort. So if you set up a work group where no one is ever individually checked for how much effort they're giving to that team or that work group, and the work group can succeed without their help, that is a situation where social loafing is going to be very likely. And unfortunately, a lot of groups projects in classes is somewhat set up this way. A lot of times there is a group grade, and a lot of times, if no one else is doing the work, at least one person could possibly get that project done without any help. It's going to be a lot of effort, but if it's important to them, then they'll do it. In that situation, social loafing is fairly likely because some people will recognize I can just fade back, I don't have to work at all, and I will still get the reward. This group will still function. And it's one of the reasons when we talked about the definition of a work group or team, there was that interdependency in there. Well, the person is still interdependent. They're dependent on the group to get it done, but they're no longer contributing. So one of the things that organizational psychologists look at when we're looking at teams is the team set up in such a way that encourages social loafing? Because if it does, people are going to loaf. Or can we set up this group or team to where it's very hard for someone to socially loaf? In that case, it's much less likely. So when we have social loafing, two main things can happen. The first thing is free riding. What this means is that someone on the team is basically perceiving, it basically happens when employees perceive their efforts are not necessary to the group's success or rewards. So if someone suddenly realizes, hey, this group is going to succeed with or without me, and though if it's with me, it would make it easier for the rest of them, I don't have to work to get the success and rewards. If someone comes to this conclusion, they're likely to free ride, at which point that person's performance goes to zero, which means that basically now from an organizational viewpoint, you have an employee that is not contributing to the productivity of the group, and that also means that person is not contributing to getting the organization to its goals. Now, if it wasn't in a group, if it wasn't in a team, it would be easy to identify this person. They're no longer working. But the group, the work team, provides a cover for this laziness or this loafing. The second thing you have to worry about with social loafing is once you have free riders, you may have a sucker effect. This occurs when a group member decides they'll no longer be the sucker and they reduce their efforts. So not only do you start to have people drop off from productivity in the group if social loafing is allowed to permit, what can happen is, especially if the overall effect, basically you have a situation where the person, think about it again in a class. If you have a group project and everyone knows that one of the people in the group is very grade driven, they want to get a good grade, they're driven by grades, they're going to do a good job, so everyone else starts to free ride. We can just let this person do the project. The person does the math and realizes this project is only worth 50 points. I already have 100 on every test. I've already done all my assignments, and there's 500 points in this class. I've got 450 points. I have an A without this project. I'm no longer going to be the sucker. I'm not doing this project either. I'm going to take the 0. I'm going to take them all down with me. Now, from a class perspective, of course, the free riders suddenly go, we don't get the reward, or maybe they'll engage and try to get something done. But the sucker effect in an organization means that now, not because of the free riders, the actual workers that are trying to get the job done also reduce their performance, resulting in the entire group failing. So social loafing isn't just a problem with a few people getting to free ride. It also can result in the entire group team or work team or group reducing their productivity. Okay, so group social loafing is the first thing we want to worry about in organizations, and again within teams or work groups. If you're looking as an organizational psychologist at a work group, you want to first ask, is a social loafing a problem? Has it been set up in such a way that social loafing is possible? And the two easiest ways to handle social loafing, again, is to make sure that each person is individually accountable for the amount of work they do, and that the project is divided in such a way that if any one person fails to do their part, it will influence the success of the entire group. When teams are set up that way, they're less likely to suffer from social loafing. They're not immune to it, but it's more likely that if the group fails, it'll be clear why the group failed in that case, and that the punishments will fall not on the whole group, but the person that didn't hold up their end. We're now going to talk about group decision making. So this is basically drawing from cognitive psychology, and it's about the process that occurs, again, in the performing phase of a group. So when a group's actually working on the problem, these are the phases that we go through, and basically group decision making has 5 steps which happen in any group decision making process. The first step is diagnosing the problem. So the group comes to an agreement on what the problem is, what the obstacles are, and how to prepare to overcome those obstacles. So it's important to realize that, again, this is a stage theory, this is a step theory, and this isn't going to explain every single decision made in a group, but it's a good way to ask yourself, if you find a group or team that is struggling in the performance process, what phase of the decision-making process do they seem to be stuck in? Once the problem is diagnosed, we then need to generate solutions. So communication to process problems and goals while trying to identify solutions. And there's a couple of effective tools that can be used in this phase. So brainstorming is all members of the group generate potential solutions without fear of criticism by other members. And it's important to note that brainstorming works best when truly it is a supportive, criticism-free environment. A lot of decision-making research has found that brainstorming does result to better decision-making and more creative decision-making, which results in better productivity in groups and organizations. However, the effectiveness of brainstorming is reduced when members are delayed in sharing their ideas. So brainstorming needs to be real-time. Brainstorming needs to be people are sitting there just throwing out ideas. Because if you delay the sharing of ideas, people will self-censor their own ideas. People will go, well, maybe that isn't a good idea. And it isn't necessarily about always throwing out great ideas. It's also about throwing out ideas that might cause someone else to come up with a better idea. Also, if there's a delay in sharing the ideas, people will start to see what other people are coming up with, and they'll start to resist putting out ideas that might counter those ideas. If members are apprehensive about voicing their ideas, if there's any worry that they might be criticized or they may be rejected for sharing their ideas, again, brainstorming is going to be less effective. And also, if people are being motivated by politics, in other words, if people in a brainstorming are really thinking more about how they're going to look and how their ideas will be received, they're going to start, again, self-censoring. They're not going to throw out all their ideas. Brainstorming works best if it really is free of these. So again, from an organizational psychologist viewpoint, if you find that a team is having a problem coming up with solutions to a problem, you may want to restructure and actually come up with a formal structure for making them do brainstorming where it's real time, there's no apprehension about voicing their ideas, and they're no longer worried about what their ideas are going to look like. Maybe even make them anonymous ideas. Everyone writes down 5 ideas. no ideas will be criticized, and we're just going to throw them all up. And then once we have them all up, we're going to think, what are ones we want to explore more? That's a good tool for brainstorming. 5 steps continued. So once you actually have all the ideas out, it's now time to criticize. And not necessarily criticize, just be critical. So evaluate all the potential solutions. So the group critically evaluates each one of the solutions, and maybe starts to even group the solutions. Here are solutions that are feasible and very well may work. Here's ideas that are great but may not be feasible. And here's ideas that just really aren't. And now we're going to try to figure out what are the best ideas we came up with. And it's very important for group decision making, especially if you're wanting it to be successful, to separate the evaluation phase from the generation phase. Generation is brainstorming and should not have any criticism involved. Once all the ideas are generated, that's when it's time to turn on and go, okay, now what is right and wrong about these ideas? After the evaluation phase is the choose a solution phase. The group now compares the remaining solutions and chooses one. Common approaches can include delegating, averaging individual inputs, majority rules, group consensus. So again, the decision may be delegated. We're going to just present our ideas to a decision maker. It may be averaging the individual inputs. What that means is, let's try to come up with not a consensus, but of these ideas, can we make one idea out of them? In other words, can we use multiple solutions? Majority rules, a simple vote. The one that gets the most votes is chosen, or maybe even an argument towards group consensus. Everyone has to decide that they all agree and buy into the idea. Once you've actually chosen a solution, the final phase in group decision making is to actually develop an action plan to implement the solution. So detailed action steps, what needs to be done to use this idea to actually result in solving the problem and getting the project done. And how are we going to monitor and evaluate the process to make sure that it's working? So ineffective decision making, that was basically, we just talked about a 5-step model of how decision making should occur. Now let's talk about some of the things that can mess that model up. In other words, these are things to look for as potential symptoms of a group that's having a problem actually being productive. One of the main things that we can look for is called process loss. It's any non-motivational element of a group situation that detracts from the group performance. So actual productivity equals potential productivity minus any losses due to faulty processes. So process loss means anything that's occurring that's hampering the productivity of the organization, or the group in this case, or the team. So process loss can be social loafing. Process loss can be a group is stuck in the storming phase. Process loss can be that people are being critical during the brainstorming phase. It basically means that the potential of the group is being lost due to processes within the group. One of the biggest types of process loss is basically informational process loss. And the idea here is that there's both shared and unshared information in any group. Shared information is information that's held by all group members. It's either information that everyone knows, or it's information that one person knows that is being freely shared with the rest of the group to make sure that the group has the potential productivity as high as possible. Unshared information is information that's only held by one group member or a small number of group members that's not being shared. This often is done for counterproductive work behavior reasons. The person doesn't want the group to succeed and therefore is holding out information. It can also be done for political reasons. I'm the only one that has this information, and that information gives me personal power in this group, and I don't want to give that power up unless I have to. So groups are ineffective at pooling unshared information. Group decisions tend to be determined more by shared information. So what that means is that when we look at that 5-step group process model, group decision making, that what's happening in that model is only being done through the process of shared information. So deciding what the problem is, brainstorming solutions, evaluating solutions, all of those phases are basically can only function with shared information. So any unshared information is process loss. It's information that's not being utilized by the group, which is resulting in the group being less productive than its potential. Again, an organizational psychologist would often look at this and go, okay, What can I do to make sure everyone's sharing the information that's necessary to optimize this group's performance? Another thing we have to look out for in groups is groupthink. So this is a mode of thinking that individuals engage in when the desire to agree becomes more dominant in a cohesive group, that it tends to override the realistic appraisal of alternate courses of action. That's a pretty dense sentence right there. But what this means is groupthink occurs when that cohesion of a group becomes very strong. So groupthink is a result of an overly cohesive group generally. And what happens is the group becomes so cohesive that everyone is more interested in staying in the group than actually getting the job done well. So at any time when an individual values their membership in the group more than they value the success of the group or the success of the group attaining organizational goals, what it likely is going to occur is groupthink. And what groupthink occurs is not necessarily that the group is not functioning, it's that the group is no longer functioning better than an individual. In fact, the group is simply supporting one individual. It has become a single mind, a groupthink. The idea behind any work group or team is that you want multiple ideas coming from multiple people. This is what happens when that stops occurring. Examples of groupthink are fairly easy to find in history. Pretty much a lot of times, if you've ever seen a news story where some of the smartest people in the world have gotten together and made some really bad decisions, this often is groupthink. It's a situation where you look and go, okay, what are the conditions in that group? Well, first, it's a very cohesive group. It's a group that thinks very highly of itself. So think of the cabinet of the President of the United States. That's a very cohesive group. Everyone there is very proud of the group they're in. They're very aware that they're an elite group of people, and people don't want to be out of that group. The next thing that happens is the group stops soliciting information from outside the group. So the group closes itself off. It basically says, we have all the expertise we need. We don't need outside help. The group now does not allow for individual opinion that differ from the majority. In other words, a strong prescriptive norm develops that you don't buck the group's decision making, that you don't rock the boat, that if the group makes a decision, because it's the group's made the right decision. Another major factor of this is the group usually will have a very strong leader that people are trying to appease. No one wants to become the bad guy in this group. So again, these four conditions also tell us how to stop groupthink. So if we know we have a very cohesive group, we need to recognize the danger of groupthink. That doesn't mean we want to stop the cohesion. Cohesion generally is a good thing. We want to be aware that though the cohesion of this group makes it susceptible to this problem. Then we want to ask, as an organizational psychologist, how do we set up to make sure this very cohesive group is always open to outside information? We want to keep that channel open, because if we keep that channel open, groupthink is less likely. We want to make sure that there's structures in that group that enforce the idea that individual opinion should be voiced, and it should be openly encouraged. Because again, if it starts to get shut down, we're on our path to groupthink. And finally, these interventions need to be supported by the leader, because cohesive groups usually will have not only a leader, but a strong leader. So if the strong leader is only interested in basically their opinions being supported by the group, groupthink becomes highly likely. So the model of groupthink is the idea that we have antecedents, causes, we have symptoms, and then we have a result. So the antecedents, so the causes of groupthink include group cohesion. High cohesion, more likely for groupthink. Isolation. The more the group it cuts itself off from others, the more likely groupthink is to occur. Strong biased leadership. In other words, not only is there a strong leader, that strong leader doesn't like to be disagreed with. And finally, high decisional stress. If the group is having to make high impact decisions with a strong leader in isolation with high cohesion, all of these are likely to lead to a situation of groupthink. The symptoms of groupthink. Once you actually have that antecedents, so you can have a group that is strongly cohesive in isolation with a strong biased leader and high decisional stress that still doesn't fall prey to groupthink. All it takes is a few people to stand up and say, I know this isn't going to be taken well, but here's a problem with what we're doing. However, if you have those four causes, those antecedents, and you start to see these symptoms, so first, a belief in the invulnerability of the group. In other words, the group starts to believe that it can't make wrong decisions. A belief in the unanimity of the group members. In other words, the group starts to believe that everyone is in agreement and isn't checking anymore to make sure that people are in agreement. If there's pressure on dissenters, in other words, if the norms say that you shouldn't speak up. I'm going to skip this next one. Rationalization. Rationalization is that basically the group itself starts to make up its own reasons for why it makes its decisions. It's no longer based on knowledge of the group. It's no longer based on decision making. It basically has resulted on, we're going to make a decision first, and then I'm going to come up with a reason why it's a good idea. We start to see stereotyping, and by stereotyping, what I'm talking about that is the idea that our group is the better group. Our group is the only group that could make this kind of decision, and other groups would be inferior. That stereotyping further supports the isolation. Self-censorship, so each person in the group starts to censor themselves. And finally, an illusion of morality. And basically what this means is the group starts to think of itself also as more morally right than other groups. Now, I went through all of the symptoms here with one exception, and that was the middle one, an appointment of a mind guard. And the reason that I kept that one separate is this is really probably the biggest warning sign of groupthink. If the group has become so isolated, so cohesive, with such a strong leader, that a new role has developed, and that role is the buffer between the rest of the group and the leader. There's someone in the group that you have to go to other than the leader. You're no longer reporting directly to the leader. And that's the person you talk to, and that person then decides whether they take your idea, your thoughts, or your problems to the leader. That is a strong symptom of groupthink. So, once you have groupthink, research has found very defective decision making. Basically, you've lost all of the benefits of good group process. Think about those 5 steps of making a good decision. They involve brainstorming a bunch of good ideas. Never going to happen in a groupthink situation. It's then going to talk about critical evaluation of those ideas. Again, not going to occur with a groupthink. What groupthink basically is one person, the strong biased leader, throws out an idea. Everyone supports the idea, whether it's right or wrong, suppresses any of their own thoughts that there might be a problem with this, and the decision is strongly supported and gone forward with. Now, sometimes that decision will be the right one, but a lot of times that decision will be the wrong one. And what occurs here is when we talk about successful decision making, we want to compare it to other possible ways to get to the decision. So the way this is done in a lab is basically you set up 3 situations. You set up a problem that has multiple solutions, but the solutions are gradable, if you will. There's bad decisions, there's bad solutions, there's moderate solutions, there's good solutions. You then basically have 3 different types of people work on the problem. You have an individual by themselves work on the problem. You have an individual that's made a leader of a groupthink type situation group. And then you have a group that's strongly supported to follow those 5 steps of basically making a group decision making. What you're going to find is that on average, of those 3, the groupthink group is going to come up with more bad decisions than any of the other 2. The individual without a groupthink around them will be more likely to question their first thoughts. They'll have a solution and they'll sit there and go, is that a good solution? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. What other things could I do? And they might come up with a better idea. The group that doesn't have groupthink is going to throw out a bunch of ideas, and they're going to talk about them non-critically, they're going to evaluate them, they're going to come up, and they're generally going to come up with a good idea. The strong leader in a groupthink situation, their very first idea is going to be locked on and supported. It's going to be rationalized. It's going to be thought of as a great idea, and it's going to be chosen whether it is good or not. And that's why a groupthink group is actually even worse than an individual making decisions. You've lost not only all of the positives of having a group of people make a decision, you've actually even hampered individual decision making. Okay, so work teams in the 21st century. Basically speaking, work teams have always been a bit of a reality in the workplace. Work groups and working in teams, working in groups has always been somewhat a part of organizational life. The thing to note, though, is that it's becoming more and more an expected part of organizational life. So work teams are work groups in which actions of individuals are interdependent, coordinated, and each member has a role. Team has common roles in organizations. So usually work teams, when you see the word work team over the idea of just a work group or just teams, a work team is a little bit more specific, and that is the idea that this is a team that always works together on multiple projects. So it's a permanent group in an organization that takes on project after project after project. Think of it as a surgical team that always works together. 2 surgeons, 2 nurse assistants, 1 anesthesiologist, and it's always the same group. That would be a work team. And each project is each new surgery. There's been a steady increase in the use of teams, specifically work teams in organizations. So in the 1980s, only about 5% of American organizations use work teams. And again, right now, I'm talking about a specific reoccurring group of people working in an organization. So when we talked about work groups and teams, we said they're interchangeable. If we're talking about a work team, we are talking about something slightly different. We're talking about a group of people that constantly have the same roles and are used to working together on multiple projects over a long period of time. Within that definition, work teams, about 5% of American organizations used such teams in the 80s, about 20% in the early 90s, and now I think we're up to about 35%. And mainly because a lot of jobs are becoming more complex, and that complex work is more successful when there is comfortable collaboration. So, types of work teams. As I said, as work teams have become more and more research has been trying to define different types of work teams and what they do. So, production teams are employees who produce output, often frontline employees. So this is, again, instead of just interchangeably, think about a factory floor that's producing automobiles. So instead of just interchanging people to where, well, you're working on this machine one time and this other time, it's more of these 5 people are going to work on this one project together on the car, and they always work together. So it's basically creating teams of people that are used to working together so they can build up kind of that informal network of these are people you're familiar with, you know how they work, and research has found that even on production level, that creating teams like that results in increased productivity. Management teams, coordinating workers to ensure production. So again, the idea of instead of having single managers, creating teams of managers that work together. And this also helps when you think about when we were talking about performance appraisal. One of the things we were discussing earlier in the chapters was the idea that multiple raters results in more accurate performance appraisal. This is also done with management teams. So there's a team that's managing a group of people, and they're all having a chance to look at performance. And again, they can get together then to coordinate those workers and to also look at performance appraisal. Service teams, employees who work together to attend to customers' needs. So again, instead of just randomly having people that are assigned sometimes to work customer service or not, it's these 3 or 4 people are our customer service team. They work together, they handle responsibilities, and again, they're working as a team. Project teams, we see this a lot with complex work, so employees who carry out specific projects only may be dissolved upon completion, but there can also be product teams that are more permanent. They keep working on different projects. So an example of this might be a group of architects. They may be brought together to do one major building and then they're separated, or it may be this is a team of architects that work on building after building after building. Sometimes project teams may also be cross-functional teams representing various departments. So a project team could also be, we're creating a brand new product from the ground up. So we're going to put together a person from marketing, a person from finance, 2 engineers, 2 design experts, and a graphic artist. And they're going to start with the idea, come up with a new product. And they're going to go from that initial idea all the way to how do we market it, how do we pay for it, how do we build it, how do we get it out onto the shelves. Advisory teams are employees who work in parallel to production processes. So an advisory team might be set employees that are also brought together to talk about common problems in an organization to advise management on possible solutions. So all of these are gaining popularity, and we're seeing more and more organizations using these various types of work teams. A very popular type of work team, especially for more complex jobs, is the idea of self-managed work teams. And a lot of research has found this is kind of the perfect storm of everything we've been talking about as far as organizational psychology so far. So when we are talking about work motivation, when we are talking about job satisfaction, when we are talking about organizational commitment, one of the antecedents of a lot of that was autonomy, your ability to have control over the work that you do. Well, a self-managed work team is the idea of taking everything we know about increasing people's satisfaction, productivity, and job commitment from their attitudes and marrying it to what we know about what makes a successful team. So it's about monitor and control the overall process of a project or product, also doling out specific tasks to team members, but this is all being done by the team. So the team monitors itself, the team controls the overall process of how it's getting the job done, whatever the actual product or goal is, and also the team decides who's going to do what. So they can schedule their own work, they can maintain their own equipment, they can come up with their own plans. Self-managed work teams function because autonomy and empowerment are positively related to team effectiveness. However, team conflict can lead to ineffectiveness. So the problem with a self-managed work team is you can't just have a self-managed work team and ignore it. As management, you need to give it enough autonomy to be able to do the work without your intervention. But management does still need to overall monitor, is the self-managed team getting the job done still? Because it has so much control, it can also result in conflict within the organization or within the actual group, which can result in ineffectiveness. So finally, let's talking about work team effectiveness. So research on the idea, and again, we're focused on this idea of work teams. So permanent or semi-permanent groups of people that have been brought together to function as a team over a longer period of time. Three main dimensions of work team effectiveness have been found. So first is just team performance. So how well is the team performing in general? So the first thing we want to worry about when we're asking, is a work team an effective work team? Is it getting the job done? The second thing is the attitudes of the team members. So reflect quality of work life, commitment, and job satisfaction. In other words, are we actually seeing the increase we'd expect from a successful team in the individual's commitment to the organization, their overall quality of their work life, and also their job satisfaction? And finally, we can look at hard objective data. How likely is it that people are withdrawing from the team? Are we seeing absences? Are we seeing tardiness? Are we seeing people leave the team? So all three of these can be metrics or things that we want to measure to determine how well a team is doing. Again, when we look at work team effectiveness, studies have found that there is two main primary types of roles that occur in teams, work teams, and that includes task work, the task-oriented aspects of the work, but also teamwork, process-oriented aspects of the work. And this is the same idea of task roles and social roles. So some of the team's time does need to be focused definitely on getting the task done, and if it isn't doing that, it's failing the very first dimension of work team effectiveness, team performance. However, the attitudes and the withdrawal behaviors are often more associated with how much time is the team spending on the social, process-oriented aspects of the work, working together as a team. So again, from an organizational psychologist viewpoint, we'd want to look at, anytime we're looking at work teams, we'd want to ask, how can we measure whether they're succeeding? How can we measure team performance? How can we measure attitudes? How can we measure withdrawal behavior? And also, how much time is the team spending on task or team work? So there's 5 categories that have been found through research to predict work team effectiveness: organizational context, group composition and size, the group work design, the intergroup process, and the external group processes. So organizational context includes rewards, goals, and feedback and training. And this again represents somewhat that self-managed work teams and work teams still need some management. So management needs to come up with methods to reward the team, to set goals, and to give feedback to that team about its attaining its goals, and may need to occasionally come in to provide training to that team. The group composition and size. It's been generally found that cognitive ability of group members and personality traits of group members both positively relate to the success of a work team. So the smarter the work team is, generally, the more productive and better it's going to work. And certain positive personality traits. The more that they're there present in the work team, the more likely the work team will work well. Also demographic characteristics of the group members. There's been mixed research here, and we'll talk about it in the next slide, that when you have very diverse groups, you can basically see two effects. Sometimes it'll reduce performance, sometimes it'll increase performance, and it really has to do with how well that diversity is being managed. Group work design, so how much is the task's interdependence and how much is the goals interdependent? So what this means again is, have you designed the work in such a way to make sure that social loafing doesn't occur? So are the tasks that everyone's doing very interdependent on everyone else doing their task? In other words, is everyone's performance integral to the overall group's performance? And also, is it clear that the goals of the group are being served by doing those tasks? Intra-group processing then includes group cohesion. The more cohesive the group, in most situations, as long as it's not too cohesive and leading to groupthink, we're going to see higher productivity of the work team. And also the group efficacy or communication processes. So how much does the group communicate internally? And also, does the group feel that it's capable of doing the tasks assigned to it? And finally, external group processes. So how much is the group communicating outside the group? And how does it interact with other groups? And again, the more it communicates with outside of the group, the more it communicates with other groups and gathers information, generally the more productive it's going to be. You can also see that these 5 categories of prediction of work team effectiveness also somewhat interrelate to how to stop social loafing and how to stop groupthink. So let's just talk about a few of these in more detail. Group composition, team personality does predict performance, and what that basically means is that the more people are similar in personality, and the more that positive personality traits such as agreeableness, conscientiousness, and also positive affect, generally the group's going to perform better. Team performance does improve when members have higher cognitive ability, favorable personality traits, and also the relevant experience. So again, relevant experience gets to that whole kind of group efficacy. We have the skills necessary to get this done. Demographic diversity amongst team members has generally been found in research to be unrelated to team effectiveness. However, diversity related to the task is positively related to team effectiveness. So if you just basically create a diverse team versus a non-diverse team on, let's say, gender, age, ethnicity, you're generally not going to find a positive or a negative effect. It doesn't have much of an effect on effectiveness of the team. However, if that diversity also is related to the task, let's say that the task is to basically, how do we better relate to a diverse group of clients? At that point, diversity is going to be positively related to team effectiveness. Also, if that demographic diversity brings expertise or educational diversity with it, and that expertise and education is relevant to the task of the group, we'll again see an increase in team effectiveness. So recent and future trends, like I said, the use of work groups has continued to expand in the areas of service, production, and project completion. More and more groups are going to using work groups and specifically work teams. Work teams will continue to become more fluid. More and more organizations are using them. And we're also seeing an expansion of the use of virtual teams. So people that are working together but are not necessarily ever in the same space. They're being put together through various technological mechanisms such as online video chatting, Google Documents, the ability to share work over large distances. And a lot of organizations are starting to select for employees specifically to look for people that are going to work well in team environment. A lot of higher level and more complex jobs now often have a role. Not only are they measuring personality, the reason they're measuring personality is to find people that are going to be more likely to work in large teams. So group preference, a preference to work in groups, general disposition, and also Big Five. Also, there's actually been marketed specific measures to determine how well you'll work in groups and also what roles you're likely to take in those groups. So the teamwork test and the team role test are 2 examples of these, of specific selection measures made not just to determine are you going to perform well in the organization as an individual, but are you going to perform well as a group member.